Zelda Wii U. That's all I can really call it right now. Nintendo has been torturing us with little trickles of information regarding the new Zelda currently in development for the Wii U and potentially the NX. Being a massive Zelda fanboy myself, I keep thinking to myself what kind of features I would like to see in the new Zelda. So these are my top 10 hopes for Zelda Wii U. Better stealth. Yeah, sounds kinda weird for Zelda, I know, but hear me out.
Zelda has a history of including little stealth segments. Usually they only appear once per game and don't tend to last very long, but I've always thought that a game like Zelda could be interesting with a bit of well thought out stealth. The best stealth segment in my opinion would be the Forsaken Fortress in Wind Waker. Sneaking past moblins was genuinely nerve wracking, especially when I was younger. They clearly thought this segment out, as there were little bits of polish that would really help push a very intense atmosphere. Such as if you're in a barrel and a moblin walks close by, if you move very slightly the moblin will notice and scare the shit out of you. It's almost like a jump scare and it fills you with intense panic. The stealth was very well justified as upon entry to the Forsaken Fortress, Link loses his sword and has no way to defend himself, so sneaking is the only other option. Stealth was included in other Zelda games such as A Link Between Worlds in the Garden Maze section, and was fairly fun thanks to the already enjoyable wall merging mechanic, although in Skyward Sword it was pretty bad. Now don't get me wrong, I like Skyward Sword, but the stealth was nowhere near as fun, and herein lies the issue. In Wind Waker, you had the barrels to hide in. A Link Between Worlds, you had the wall merging, but in Skyward Sword, you just have your basic skills, and it can be kinda hard to know when you're actually hidden, since you don't have any mechanics which lend themselves to stealth. Even pressing against the wall, another feature which was in Wind Waker, would have been handy. Unless you like trying to retrieve your gear while having no clue as to what constitutes being hidden. Due to the open world nature of Zelda Wii U, it would make sense to have agency in how to approach a situation, such as sneaking up behind an enemy to deal a deadly blow. Not saying they have to go full Metal Gear Solid 5 with it, but it's just something I feel would fit in Zelda.
Aging. Admittedly, this is kind of an ambitious thing to hope for. Zelda's relationship with Link aging has been quite an interesting one.
I feel like every now and then we hear about Nintendo wanting to add aging to Zelda, and it never happening. The prime example being Ocarina of Time. As originally, among lots of other ambitious features, Ocarina of Time was meant to have progressive aging, which was handled by the amount of time you spent playing the game, in any given playthrough. So your age at the end of the game would have been different depending on how long it took you. That, or it could have been dependent on the progression of the story. We'll never really know, since these features ultimately never made it into the final version of Ocarina of Time. Instead, they opted for the 7-year jump via the Temple of Time instead. Definitely a much simpler decision, especially for N64. Zelda Wii U seems to feature a fairly young looking Link, and it makes me really want to see progressive aging come into play. Since the game is going for the whole open world thing, it feels like the perfect time to see such a feature. When I think about it though, I can imagine it being a fairly complex feature to implement cleanly, since the story would need to be done in a way that could fit Link being different ages without any inconsistencies. For example, if Link was to get older, would the characters around him get older? What about that guy? Would he age? Those are problems which need solved in order to fully implement a feature like this. I trust Nintendo though, especially with Zelda. They care a lot about the quality of Zelda games, especially the main installments on home console. Even with the complications, if anybody can do it, it's Nintendo. Might be a long shot, but let's hope for aging.
Time travel or some sort of dimensional change. Having some sort of second dimension or drastic change to the game's overworld is nothing new to Zelda, but how could it be done again?
Going back to Ocarina of Time, there's the aforementioned time skip, the Dark Worlds of A Link Between Worlds or A Link to the Past, or the Twilight Realm in Twilight Princess, although the Twilight Realm to a much lesser extent since that was quite a small contained area. Lore-wise, very fascinating but not a serious game changer in terms of the game's overworld. Zelda Wii U, as I've mentioned, and will probably mention a lot throughout this video, has a very open sandboxy world to explore. The perfect opportunity to have some sort of different dimension, sort of like in A Link Between Worlds with the Dark World Lorule, which was a decaying, ruined mirror image of Hyrule. Seeing something similar with the vast overworld of Zelda Wii U would be incredible. Once friendly locations which are bright and happy could be dark and ripe with enemies, or even returning to the time travel concept once again. Seeing Zelda return to the whole young Link, adult Link contrast would honestly be a welcome addition in the eyes of many people, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. since time travel was well utilised in Skyward Sword in a pretty interesting way. A prime example is in Skyward Sword when you go to meet the Thunder Dragon. It turns out he's dead, and has been so for a very long time. You take a fruit from the Tree of Life, plant it in the past, go back to the present, grab the fruit, return to the past and feed it to the dragon, who, when you return to the present again, is now alive, and able to aid you in your quest. I particularly enjoyed this use of time travel, as it felt very conducive. Plenty of ways they could take it, and I would be nothing but happy with either time travel or some sort of dimensional jump to return once again.
Unnecessary yet awesome polish. This is kind of a minor one, as it doesn't really have any kind of drastic effect on the game overall. It's just something I personally enjoy.
The first time I played Majora's Mask and I got to this section, this moment blew my young mind. I remember exactly what I did at that point. I stopped, jumped back down, and did it again. No doubt like 10 times over. I found it so cool. Link did a side flip, then a front flip. It was so cool. When playing Majora's Mask, it made those jumps feel so much more satisfying. So much so that when I was younger, I would literally seek out sections in the game where I could do fancy jumps. Since it wasn't completely random, it did seem to be tied to certain platforms. Another example of little flares or polish like this, whatever you want to call it, would be a lot about Twilight Princess's gameplay. The sword flourish in particular. It's so badass. Usually occurring after a fight with more than a couple of enemies, you just stand still and put your sword away and are greeted to an entirely unnecessary but oh so satisfying sword showmanship. As well as the sword flourish, Twilight Princess had some extra polish in certain areas which I feel fit into this category, mainly in regards to Epona. For instance, did you know that if you run at Epona from behind, you can climb onto her and immediately set off? Might not seem too impressive, but they didn't need to bother programming this, but they did anyway, which shows the level of care that went into these things. Same applies for getting off of Epona, although in this case the criteria to pull it off is a bit more selective. When you're being actively pursued by enemies, you can backflip off of Epona instantly instead of clambering down off of her. These little things might not seem very important, but something about them gives the game character. I associate Twilight Princess as the game with the sword flourish, Majora's Mask with fancy jumps, and Wind Waker with shifty eyes. I really hope to see something like this in Zelda Wii U.
Instruments. Now, I love Ocarina of Time, let's just get that out in the open. But my love for Ocarina of Time is not the reason I want to see instruments return.
Not that they've even truly left the series, there have been some items which sort of filled the gap. Things like the Wind Waker or perhaps the harp from Skyward Sword, but none compare to the Ocarina in terms of its utilization and simple joys it brings to the game. With its simple 5-button controls and its range of uses, from warping you around the world, calling upon Epona to pick you up, or activating certain puzzle points in the game. The Ocarina was a wonderful addition to both Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Not only did it contribute to the game as a means of transport and helping with certain puzzles, it was just fun to mess around with. Who would have ever thought you could play the Super Mario Bros. Theme in Zelda? It doesn't need to be an ocarina, but I would love to see some sort of new instrument that can be utilised in a way similar to that of the ocarina. Since it helped so much with traversing the world through the use of the warp songs, and with a big sandboxy world as gigantic as what's shown in Zelda Wii U, it would be nice to travel around once again via the power of music. Not much else to say on this one, but I hope we get to see Link show off his musical chops once again.
Character customization. Now, I've always been a big fan of character customization, and I've always enjoyed how in certain games like Twilight Princess or Ocarina of Time, you can choose how Link dresses based on his tunic, his shield, or his sword, so this is kind of a minor one.
Being able to switch tunics just because you fancy a change was always a nice option. Same goes for things like swords and shields. Sometimes you'd be Blue Tunic Link with a mirror shield, Bigorren sword and hover boots, then other times you'd prefer going classic Green Tunic, Master Sword and normal boots. Nintendo has demonstrated attempts to add more change into how Zelda's inventory of equipment is handled, most significantly in Skyward Sword, which may come as a surprise, but hear me out. What I liked about Skyward Sword was how you were able to upgrade items like the bow and arrow, the beetle, and most importantly your shield. Now, while I like this in Skyward Sword, you're all no doubt aware it was fairly limited. You had a set number of upgrades that, while changed aesthetically, were more about the stat improvements than the overall look. But taking this concept and expanding upon it would be amazing for Zelda Wii U. Imagine being able to change tunic colours, patterns or styles, what kind of shield you'd want and how you want it to look. Of course, you'd still get the good old Hylian shield down the line or the standard green tunic, but these kinds of changes would be something I'd be very interested to see. What can I say, I'm a sucker for games with customization, and since Onoma likes to push the notion that Link is the embodiment of the player, it would be nice to see the player given some agency in regards to how Link looks. And I think that given these options, it would help strengthen this idea of Link as a player avatar, rather than him just being his own character.
The return of magic. Now, magic is something that's been in the Zelda series since all the way back on the NES, and over recent years has been lacking slightly.
Magic has become a common element found within the Zelda games, allowing Link to accomplish all kinds of magical feats. Conjuring a massive fireball, turning into a fairy, teleporting, creating a magic shield for defense. The list goes on. But magic hasn't played as large a role in most recent Zelda titles such as Twilight Princess or Skyward Sword, which is actually quite disappointing for me. I always enjoyed the magic aspect of Zelda. It made the world feel so much more, well, for lack of a better word, magical. Some people found having to find magic jars to refill the bar rather cumbersome and tedious, but it never really bothered me too much. Admittedly, magic has been making more of an appearance as of lately thanks to A Link Between Worlds, and personally I think the magic in A Link Between Worlds was handled very well, since instead of the traditional magic bar which you need to find jars to refill, they opted for a bar which automatically refills, but this of course was to accommodate the game's unique item system, since instead of having to pick up individual item ammunition, such as bombs and arrows, they all just ran off this one magic bar, but could only be used for as long as you had magic. I'm unsure if this particular system would work in Zelda Wii U, since it fit A Link Between Worlds due to its more 2D gameplay. Personally, I'd like to see the return of the more classic magic as seen in Ocarina of Time. It was simple to understand and made more sense. Something else we haven't seen since Ocarina of Time is the spells. In Ocarina of Time, there were only 3 spells: Din's Fire, Farore's Wind, and Nairu's Love. Now I would love to see these sorts of spells return. Even ones found in Zelda 2 would be interesting to see these days, such as the Life Spell which let Link heal himself without the need of a potion. But we can probably all agree, what Zelda Wii U really needs is the ability to transform into a fairy.
Non-linear gameplay. Now, something that Nintendo has been striving for more and more with Zelda is making sure that the game's progression is non-linear.
This just means you can work your way through the game in whatever order you prefer. Their most prominent game with this concept in mind is the most recent A Link Between Worlds, which was built to be an open-ended experience. But with a non-linear game, it comes with some complications. It can be really hard to structure a story when you tackle events in any order. In Ocarina of Time, the game was pretty linear, which meant that when making it, they could structure the story to follow a certain path. With this in mind, they could implement story-crucial cutscenes and events that were predicated on certain events having been completed. Ocarina of Time also had the habit of picking up game-crucial items in dungeons, which were crucial for later dungeons, which contributed to the game's linear nature, meaning that you're supposed to go through the game in a certain order. While picking up items in dungeons for use later isn't a bad idea, it heavily contributes to the linear nature. A Link Between Worlds got around this with Ravio's shop by making it so that you could rent and later purchase any of the game's crucial items, meaning that if a temple required a particular item, you could just rent it and tackle that particular temple without having to stick to a set order. Now, for Zelda Wii U, would I like the system of buying items? Part of me says yes, since it worked well in A Link Between Worlds, and I loved the choices I had in my adventure to do it in whatever order I felt like. And it seems like open world is what they're going for, what with this massive overworld, which makes me think the game will be more sandboxy in nature. I'm not sure if I'd like the exact same system of rent, buy, and lose your rented items when you fall in battle, but I'd certainly like to see something similar. Another component of A Link Between Worlds' open nature I really liked were the mini puzzle dungeons you could find littered throughout the world. They offered small rewards in comparison to the big dungeons, just in the form of rupees and heart pieces, but more things to do outside the main story would be great, particularly something like the Bomber's Notebook from Majora's Mask, as interacting with the stories found around Termina was one of my favourite things about that game, and it would be great to see something similar make a return. There are plenty of ways Nintendo could take with Zelda Wii U to make it feel like more of an open experience. I think it's a safe bet to say that's the direction they're headed in, and any of the things I just mentioned would be welcomed with open arms by me at least.
Better use of Ganon. Zelda in recent years has gained a bad habit of introducing some sort of big new baddie like Yuga, Zant, or Girahim, just for the plot to be hijacked by Ganondorf in the last half hour.
I mean, granted, in Skyward Sword it was Demise and not Ganon, but he essentially served the same purpose and was technically Ganon. Like how Link was the original hero, whose spirit carried on to the future heroes. Demise is the original incarnation of Ganon. Ganondorf himself is definitely an interesting character. He is the one male Gerudo born every 100 years. I don't know how that works, but sure, I'll try to understand how that works. He is supposedly a thief and a tyrant, but these are all traits which are never really demonstrated. The best interpretation which best encompasses this is probably Ocarina of Time, at least in terms of its design. I can look at him and believe he's a thief who comes from a hot, sandy part of Hyrule, whereas in a game like Twilight Princess, he looks more like a king, very regal in how he dresses and acts. Of course, this isn't about his design, but more about how he's utilised. I miss when Nintendo tried with Ganondorf, back in the days of the NES. They hyped Ganon up so much, painting him as this great evil doombringer. They even had a bit of this in Wind Waker by the way the camera teased you with glimpses of him, but never truly showing him off until much further down the line. It shows in Twilight Princess that Nintendo were clinging too closely to their tried and true Zelda formula. It's a Zelda game, we should probably shove Ganondorf in at some point. Either use Ganondorf and paint him as the greatest evil the world has ever known, hyping up his reveal and making him feel valid, rather than a begrudging necessity, or give somebody else the villain spot. Hell, people are raging fanboys when it comes to Vati, so it goes to show when you give somebody else a chance, the audience can be quite receptive, as it can feel like a fresh change of pace.
Worthwhile exploration. This is my number one because we've had little teases of this, and it's something I'd really like to see Nintendo capitalise on.
Admittedly, this is something Nintendo is getting better at with Zelda. Honestly, the best example of this would be Wind Waker. Man, what happened after Wind Waker that caused Nintendo to stop being so creative? Wind Waker was amazing in so many ways. Then you get Twilight Princess, which was good to a certain extent, but was pretty formulaic for Zelda, sticking to the basic tried and true Zelda tropes. Ugh, this isn't what I'm supposed to be talking about. Wind Waker! In this game, you were given free reign over a large open ocean, each quadrant of the map containing an island, and a lot of them had nothing to do with the main plot. So, if you just played the story through and didn't venture out to explore, you'd never see everything the overworld had to offer. It's questionable just how worthwhile the exploration was, but it certainly felt more rewarding than something like Twilight Princess. You'd come across minigames, side quests, great fairies, and just unique and interesting islands. It always felt so immersive, just being alone on an uncharted island. It really felt like the world was big and alive. Another game which did this well was A Link Between Worlds, with their mini-dungeons. Usually just offering things like rupees and heart pieces, but whenever you found a little cave, it had something to offer. A nice distraction from the main quest. I don't know what kind of exploration I'd like, but considering the size of the overworld in Zelda Wii U, I'm hoping for more interesting little caves with maybe unique items. Imagine going through one of the mini cave dungeons and finding a clothing item or something like that. It would make you want to seek these caves out, but like I said before, that's just me because I'm a sucker for customization.
So that's my top 10 hopes for Zelda Wii U. Maybe you agree with some of them, maybe you don't. But regardless, let's hope that Zelda Wii U is a good game. I'm pretty confident that I'll enjoy it, but then again, I'm a big fan of Skyward Sword, so yeah. What can I say? Zelda just has this hold on me. Well. Zelda. Boobies.